So, if scientists want to study the brain, which essentially is the chief integrator and organizer of the nervous system, well, there are a number of ways in which scientists can do it. They can examine autopsy tissues. They can examine the brains of cadavers. They can also test the behavior of patients who have brain damage. Think about the case of Phineas Gage, for example. Phineas Gage, he was a railroad worker who had a railroad spike, an explosion. A railroad spike went through his cheek and out the top of his head. So he had some serious brain damage. What happened was it destroyed part of his prefrontal cortex, and it actually led to some changes in his personality. So testing people like that who have brain damage kind of gives you an idea of some of the some of the functions of the brain. Because if a person loses a certain part of the brain, then you can kind of see where this person's deficit is now. They might even do some lesioning, and this is often done with rats and other animals. The scientists will intentionally destroy a certain portion of the brain to essentially shut off the function to see what would happen, to see how the organism would be affected by that. Oftentimes, though, we don't need to do that. We can use technology to look at brains while they are still alive. So an EEG, for example, records brain activity from the surface of the scalp. If you want to get more detailed pictures, you can do neuroimaging various ways. One type of image is an X-ray. Here are some examples of X-rays of the brain. Here you get a little bit more detail with a CT scan or CAT scan. Here's another type of scan called a PET scan. You have the MRI is another PET scan. And finally, the fMRI, which kind of gives a real detailed picture of the function of different parts of the brain. You can see the brain activity as it's happening. So these are some very interesting ways in which scientists can study the brain. Okay, now we're going to be talking about various parts of the brain and the various functions that they serve. So, for example, we have the cerebral cortex, which is essentially can be summarized as the higher brain functions that we have as human beings. The higher it would be in the cerebral cortex. And each of those, the cerebral cortex has 4 lobes, which essentially have different functions. Well, we'll get to that in a bit. You have the amygdala, which is an important part of the brain, involving emotions like fear and anger, and being able to pick up things that you need for survival. Hippocampus has some important roles in memory. We've talked about that before. That particularly in taking taking memories and short-term memory, storing it into long-term memory. The pons is important for sleep and arousal. The cerebellum is important for motor coordination. The medulla is important for breathing reflexes. The reticular formation is involved in arousal as well as for what are called stereotypic behaviors, like walking, things that we can all just typically do as human beings. The hypothalamus regulates drinking, eating, and sex, and also body temperature. So it's sort of like the regulatory function. And finally, the thalamus here is like the switchboard that incoming information, sensory information is processed by the thalamus and to the rest of the brain. So let's continue. Okay, the hindbrain. This part of the brain is like the more primitive, basic survival, basic survival parts of our brain. So the brainstem is kind of that unit there. You have the medulla, controlling your breathing, reflexes, pons, sleep and arousal, and the cerebellum, which is involved in motor coordination. So again, these are, so again, if you can think about it, like imagine if somebody had damage to the cerebellum, you could see that they would probably have difficulty with moving around, while if somebody had damage to the pons, they would have problems with their sleep and wake cycle. The midbrain, you have a structure called the substantia, an area called the substantia nigra. People who have Parkinson's disease, their dopamine activity in this area is dramatically decreased. So this is where the part of the brain where people with Parkinson's disease have problems. Reticular formation involves the stereotypes of again, like walking, like we all human beings, unless there's some physical problem, can walk, and it's kind of like the thing that we all can do. And the fact that we can just go ahead and kind of do it automatically is controlled by this reticular formation. Forebrain. In the forebrain, we have an important area called the limbic system, which is important for memory and emotion. So we have the structure like the amygdala, again, that's for like fear and anger, as well as being able to see the things that we need for survival. The hippocampus is very important for memory, formation and recall of memories. So if you have damage to your hippocampus, you are going to be very likely to have memory problems. Finally, the thalamus is kind of like the switchboard for the brain. Bringing in information coming in from the sensory receptors across our body, gets sent to our brain. So through the thalamus sends it to the appropriate place. Basal ganglia, another part of the brain. This is involving the coordination of voluntary movement. So again, another part of our brain that's involved in motor coordination. Hypothalamus is very important for regulating our eating, drinking, sex, body temperature, and this is a sense that when you think of the concept of homeostasis, the hypothalamus is crucial to the way in which we maintain our processes, maintain this regulate our functions. And again, it's also involved in emotions, stress, and rewards. So hypothalamus is an extremely important small part of it. But again, when you think about these particular structures that we've been pointing out, these particular structures are very specialized in terms of their function. If we're talking about the cerebral cortex, there's maybe more plasticity there, but for example, your brain can't rebuild the hypothalamus that's been destroyed. So there are certain parts of the brain that really don't have the plasticity that other areas of the brain do. Okay, so here we are with the cerebral cortex. The neocortex is the outermost layer. Again, you can see the 4 lobes there. The occipital lobe in the back is vision. The temporal lobe down below for hearing, language processing, and memory. Frontal lobe involving intelligence, personality. This is who we are. and of course our voluntary movement. The parietal lobe is essentially like our spatial location, our attention processes, and our motor control is in the parietal lobe. If you take a look here at the cerebral cortex, you see, look at there are different areas, specialized areas within this, like for example the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex. Let's talk a little bit about these other. Somatosensory cortex is in the parietal lobe, and this processes our body sensations, our sense of touch. Gets processed in this area of the brain. The motor cortex also is in the frontal lobe, and this controls our voluntary movement. And what's interesting is that you can go point-to-point mapping, where you can identify a specific part of the motor cortex and link it to a specific part of the body. So stimulate a specific area in the motor cortex, and a specific body part will move. Stimulate a specific part of the somatosensory cortex, and a particular bodily sensation will be felt. So each point of the body can correspond. Each point in these cortexes point to specific points in our body. Most of the brain, however, is in what we call the association cortex, and these involve associations between the various parts of the cortex, so it's, having various functions. Now, if you take a look at these figures are called homunculi. And these homunculi are very special ones, besides the fact that they look really weird. They reflect the model based on our sensory cortex and our motor cortex. This figure here on the left represents the somatosensory cortex. So basically, the larger the area in the sensory cortex, the larger the corresponding body part will be. Why are these hands so huge? Why is that tongue so big? Well, these are very sensitive parts of the body, and therefore more brain area is devoted to these parts of the body. Therefore, when you do point-to-point mapping, this is the kind of picture you get. The backs of our legs are not very sensitive, so therefore the legs are going to be really small. But the hands are very sensitive, and they're bigger. Motor model is even more dramatic. The hands are huge, and the fingers are huge. Why? Because it takes a lot of coordination. It takes a lot of it takes a lot of dexterity, such as to be able to use your hands, like playing piano, playing guitar. Using your fingers is very. It takes a lot of brain power, essentially, when we're talking about motor control of these complex activities. So therefore, a large portion of the motor cortex is devoted to controlling the hands and fingers, and also the mouth and the tongue for speaking. Not a lot devoted to the legs, right? Well, you know, what can the knee do? The knee can bend, and that's it. Bend up and down, that's it. There's not much you could do with the knee. It doesn't rotate, it doesn't do anything that spectacular. So the amount of brain power needed to control the knee is very small. But there's a lot that's needed to control the various intricate movements of our fingers, of our fine motor skills. Another interesting thing about the way we process information is that we have the ability to recognize faces, and it's kind of something we take for granted. We see someone we know, we recognize their face, we wave to them, and that's fine, we know them. Some people may be better at recognizing faces than others. Some people may be better at recognizing people. We may forget who we met. Oh, I don't remember. The face looks familiar. So some may be better. But there are people who have what is called prosopagnosia. And this is called face blindness. They have the ability to see. They're not blind. But faces, they don't recognize faces. When they see faces, they may see faces. They may see some eyes, nose, and mouth, whatever. But they don't recognize them as people they know. People who have very severe face blindness, they won't even be able to recognize the face of their wife or their children. They won't recognize their faces. They have to use other clues like their voice, what they're wearing, or whatnot. But by the face alone, they can't recognize it. And it may have to do with a certain area of the brain called the fusiform face area, which is a part of the brain which may be specific for processing faces. Maybe people who have prosopagnosia, essentially there may be some damage or some malfunction in that particular area. So it's very interesting how one of the things we take for granted is our ability to recognize faces. And it has to do with how our brains are wired to put together. We put faces. The way we recognize faces is a lot different from the way we recognize regular objects. Faces seem to be, we're really wired to recognize faces very clearly. It's a fact that we maintain a social sense. If we were unable to recognize faces, then it would be hard to form socializations. Meanwhile, if you fail to recognize a specific type of bowl or plate, it doesn't really much matter. So it's important for us to be able to recognize faces, and apparently our brain is built that way, such that it's built. An interesting line of research involves split brain research. And this comes about when you have people who have surgery to sever what is called the corpus callosum. The corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres of the brain. Remember I said that the brain has two hemispheres, a right and a left hemisphere, which, the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and they also have some specializations in terms of, the left brain may be more verbal, the right brain may be more nonverbal. But we have a connection between these two hemispheres, the corpus callosum, so there's always going to be some direct communication between the two halves of our brain. Well, what happens if you sever, if you cut the corpus callosum, essentially cut off the two brains? This is kind of a radical surgery that is sometimes done for people who have like severe epilepsy. Maybe with cutting through corpus callosum, you can isolate any seizures to one half of the brain. It'll be less likely to put the poor guy out of commission. So basically, having these patients who've had the corpus callosum, now you can actually do some interesting research and see how they differ from people who have not had this surgery. Yeah, as I said before, there is specialization in the different hemispheres. The left hemisphere, for example, is important for verbal processing, speech, and grammar. It's also, again, the right side of your body, controlling the right side of the body. Now, interesting, there's an area of the brain called the Broca's area, which is in the left hemisphere, which is involved in, and people who have damage to the Broca's area have problems getting words out, have problems with speech. If you recall, the U.S. representative in Arizona named Gabrielle Giffords, who was shot in the head, and she's been taking a long time for recovery. But one of the things she needed to relearn how to do is to relearn how to talk. She could not get the words out. There was nothing wrong with her cognitively. She knew what she wanted to say. she had difficulty getting the word out. Even if you see a public appearance by Gabby Giffords, she speaks kind of hesitantly and takes a long time to get the words out. And that is because damage to the Broca's area left her, where she had to relearn how to talk. And it's something we take for granted. But boy, oh boy, it's hard. It's hard to be able to compensate for that. Meanwhile, Wernicke's area is a part of the brain that's involved in the recognition of speech. It's in the right hemisphere. Actually, no, but it's involved in recognizing language. The Wernicke's area, if you have damage to the Wernicke's area, you're going to have difficulty understanding speech. So with the Broca's area, you have difficulty speaking, but with Wernicke's area, you have difficulty understanding speech. The right hemisphere is involved in spatial perception, visual recognition, and emotion. This is in the nonverbal part of our brain. Again, I mentioned that the corpus callosum, the procedure where you would cut the corpus callosum, essentially creating, in a way, two brains. You're severing the direct contact between the two hemispheres. Well, you have this kind of research that's done with split brain patients, very interesting. If you take a look at this woman here, so this woman here, the subject would be a subject who had the split brain, who had the corpus callosum cut, so again having the two nearly independent brains working. She's asked to stare at the dot in the center there. Okay? Staring at the dot. The word heart comes up on the screen. Her left eye sees this half, her right eye sees this half. The word is shot up very quickly. When she's asked to say what word did she see, she says art. And this is because left hemisphere controls the right eye, and it also controls speech. So what her right eye saw and said was art. What did the left eye see? When she is asked to point with her left hand to the word she saw, she points to the word he. This is because the left side of the body is controlled by the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is more nonverbal. So she can point to it with the left hand and essentially shows the two halves of the brain kind of working independently in this very controlled experiment. In reality, people who have the corpus callosum cut, they are usually functioning pretty well. So they don't really have any kinds of strange issues like this.